We talk a lot about video games that I have personally experienced, but what if we took a second to stand back and look at video gaming history from a different perspective, by looking at the last 30 NES games ever released? I'm excited to talk about this, and I'm sure that many of you have heard of every single game that's going to be mentioned here today. One of the things that I like about this project is that in looking at these games, we get to see the development perspective of some of our favorite companies, as they prepared to jump to the next generation of gaming with the Super Nintendo. Let's begin. Whew, starting off strong. It's a TV game where we make the dinosaurs look like really cool dudes, but it's not fun. Now can I watch Lanky Box? Was the exact thing my 6-year-old daughter said when I popped this into the emulator on my computer and let her sit down for an hour with controller, letting her simply color a dinosaur. I guess at the end of the day, it wasn't fun for kids either. I had wishful thinking though. Color a Dinosaur was covered in our previous episode talking about impractically expensive NES games because you're paying $1,000 for a coloring game. And like the expert said, it's not that fun. It is a novelty game though, with a specific demographic in mind, and I can appreciate that. Bobble Part 2 is a rare title, and you're going to pay a little if you want to obtain it, roughly $400 plus. The game itself is a continuation of the Bobble lineage, but featuring two different characters, Cubby and Rubby, the descendants of our original protagonists, Bub and Bob. But I did fail to mention one tiny little thing. Bub and Bob have been our protagonists through Bobble and Parasol Stars, and in the manual, it mentions that we play as Bub and Bob, but on the back cover, it says Cubby and Rubby. Well, which ones do you think are in this game? This one had a tandem release from a company that I historically despise, Ocean, which for all intents and purposes is the British version of LJN, at least as far as I'm concerned. Ocean took the task of making a game based on the 1992 hit series The Addams Family, which if we go even further back, was based on a comic strip by Charles Addams. Now, this game in particular, it is a downgrade, and again, this is not meant to be disrespectful. This game was just natively on the Super Nintendo, and it had downgraded ports, one for the NES and another for the Game Boy, and even then, it is slightly different. The NES port is more closely aligned with the 1992 game, The Addams Family, so expect for it to be presented in that fashion. In the game, we play as Pugsley, who gets challenged by Wednesday to go on a scavenger hunt. It's a pretty simple game. Is it bad that I've yet to play a Star Trek game to completion? I come from a Star Wars house. There was no Star Trek lore abundant in my memory banks growing up. Dad made sure of that. It's funny too, he would tell me if I got straight A's in high school, he would sit down and watch one Star Trek movie with me. If I didn't, I would have to sit with him through the extended cuts of the Lord of the Rings DVD trilogy that he had just bought. That being said, the Lord of the Rings trilogy extended cut is a tremendously wonderful DVD set and a masterpiece from Peter Jackson. I was a fucking idiot in high school. Anyway, Star Trek The Next Generation is a spaceship simulator created by Imagineering, which served as an in-house developer for Absolute Entertainment. These guys go all the way back to the Atari 2600, so they are a legacy company. When you think of Imagineering, think of A Boy and His Blob, Battletank, Super Battletank, and a few like River Raid 2, if you're old enough to recall it. In the game, we play as Starfleet cadets who are participating in various training simulations that vary in difficulty. Now, I have played a game similar to this, but it was on the 32X, Star Trek Starfleet Academy Bridge Simulator, or something like that. Personally, I can't really get into simulation games if I don't know anything about the subject matter, but if you're into Star Trek, you might want to check this one out. I didn't even know this was on the NES. The sole experience I had with this game prior to this episode was on the Sega Genesis, and I believe at some point in my life, I played the Sega CD version, probably because the nerd did. This game was released on, like, anything that you could play it on in 1993, the Genesis, Super Nintendo, Master System, DOS, Game Gear, you name it, it was on there. This is the NES version, which was made by Probe. In other words, it's Acclaim dragging their nuts across their forehead. We play as Jonathan Harker, who breaks out of Count Dracula's dungeon and then returns to end his life. It's based on the film, and if you know the film, you can easily follow the plot of this game.
You sunk my battleship!
That's a catchphrase that never got old, kinda like, Remember Crossfire? Yeah. What about Battleship? I'm sure many of you do. But in the off chance that we have a younger viewer that might not know what it is, it's a Milton Bradley board game where you have a folding box in front of you. You arrange your ships in the configuration that you want, and you and your opponent take turns guessing where the other player's ships are. You either hit or you miss. The top side of the box faces you, and it allows you to mark what shots you've made, and when you finish the game, you lose all of the pegs under the couch. The dog eats them, and then it looks like sprinkles of white and red in the yard. True story. The NES game is exactly that, minus the pegs. And with bonus missiles! Yeah, you heard that right. It deviates from the standard game because you can call in air support and get better coverage with your shots. This game is awesome. As the game goes on, you get more and more unique weapons, and it's worth checking out. Alexei Pajitnov changed the world with his 1985 release of Tetris, and it's a damn shame that it took him so long to be able to claim his work. Chalk it up to the geopolitical climate at the time and the requirements of the Soviet Union. Because all video game belonged to great leader Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, comrade. That's not even the worst part. Spectrum, Holobyte, Nintendo, EA, they all had this bullshit era of pulling Alexei around, and he didn't deserve that. Tetris is one of the greatest games of all time, and it did spawn a sequel, Tetris 2. And unlike the original Tetris, this was spawned during Nintendo's era of controlling the rights. It's a little bit different than traditional Tetris, and it plays more like Dr. Mario. Instead of clearing lines by occupying space, we just need to match 3 of any particular blocks, and then they clear. It's not very often that I get to talk about games created by Gremlin, and to me, they are a wonderful development company from Britain, and they had massive influence over the primitive years of home computer video gaming. And I give them all the credit for making some absolute bangers. They also gave DMA Design a chance, the company that would inevitably become Rockstar Games. If you recall in a previous episode, I mentioned that the #1 way to get your shithole software out there for the world to enjoy was to tag some sports celebrity on it. Racing wasn't safe from this treatment, and Nigel Mansell was the lucky man to be put on the cover. The game itself, it runs fairly well for being a first-person racing game, and the theme song is a bop too. We can choose our tires, manage specific aspects of the car, such as gearbox ratio. It's a cool little simulator. Would a list of early 90s games be complete without Arnold being involved? I don't think it would. Between him and Sylvester Stallone, we were bound to at least have one of their films put on the NES, and trust me, they were. This just happens to fall in the final 30. The Last Action Hero is a 1993 fantasy comedy film. A kid named Danny goes to the movies, and because he has this golden ticket from Houdini, he gets sucked into the fantasy world where he meets a main character from the movie he was watching, Jack Slater. The two team up and go up against the big bad villain, and end scene. Now, if I hadn't seen the film, I would be vehemently confused while playing the NES game because the game is a brawler. It's really obtuse too. So don't look too hard into the plot, just play the game. Imagine you're a dude running around and beating people up. It's a better way to digest it. The Flintstones Surprise at Dinosaur Peak is one of those games that you're going to fork out far more money than I'm comfortable admitting. It's a later era NES release courtesy of Taito, and if there's one thing I can say about Taito in the 90s is that they weren't great at promoting their products. In the case of Surprise at Dinosaur Peak, they gave less coverage to the United States and more coverage to South America, which played a role in the rarity of this game. It's a simple platformer where we play as either Fred or Barney, and our objective is to work our way to the top of a volcano to defeat the fire dinosaur. I don't really see the appeal of it, but hey, if you want to check it out, be my guest. This game is mean. It's a mean-ass simulator. It's basically a pool shark in a cartridge. And I put this on the list of hardest NES games because it is mean as hell. This game is one ashtray full of camels and 5 spilled beers away from being an immersive pool game. For what it is, though, it's not bad. The only issue I have with it is that the AI is unforgiving as fuck, right? They're just stupid. They're pool sharks. In tournament mode, you really have to rely on good quality performance or RNG to make sure that you win. It's just pool with, various different modes of play, be it 8 ball, 9 ball, 3 balls, 2 balls between your legs, you name it, you can play it. We covered this in the shortest NES episode because it is an incredibly short game. In a time period where LJN was scooping up important licenses for TV shows and toy lines important to children of the 80s, In particular, LJN had a chokehold on licensed WWF games, and to me, many of them are subpar. But out of all of the NES wrestling games I played, King of the Ring stood out to me. The game is simple. We have two modes of play. The first is the titular King of the Ring tournament, where we choose one wrestler and go on a homoerotic manfest of tossing dudes around in a tournament. I don't know much about the rules, but at some point after beating the dog shit out of a set amount of people, I got a congrats screen and the ending credits. Or you could just do a WWF championship run in the tournament. It also has the normal stuff like one-on-one and tag team matches. It's a good game for what it is. Party on! Excellent! THQ! Oh no! Yeah, this is a THQ game. By the way, did you know that the same guy that created LJN created THQ? He did. His name is Jack Friedman, and he also created Jack's Pacific, the laser tag company. Well, much like LJN, THQ loved the idea of making video games based on things that were culturally relevant. And in this case, it's the 1992 comedy film Wayne's World, which was based on an SNL sketch of the same name. The good news is the game is faithful to the plot of the movie, where Wayne and Garth are trying to keep a media mogul from buying out their TV show. The bad news is the game is lazy as lazy can be, it's easy, it's cheesy, and it's just silly. To be fair, there were two more versions of this game, one on the Super Nintendo and one for DOS, but I haven't played them. Why stop THQ with movies when they can publish games about TV shows too? You remember Ren and Stimpy? My dad would not let me watch this, and it took me being an adult to understand why. This is a raunchy-ass show. The game itself is based on the idea that Stimpy makes a product known as the GameTron 5000 Moneymaker, which gives you money for every game you beat. Sounds like a sweet deal, right? Now, I've never seen a single episode of Ren and Stimpy to its completion, but the levels do stem from the source material, Space Madness, Out West, and Robin Hook. There was another Ren and Stimpy game that came out. It was called Ren and Stimpy Videos. Yeah, came out 1 month prior, and it was for the Super Nintendo. There weren't that many hockey games on the NES, at least not as many as there were football or baseball games. It seems that hockey had two different faces on the system. Either it was left and right arcade action, or it was up and down. Similar to what we would see with EA's interpretation of the sport, which for all intents and purposes would be the standard for hockey moving forward. Pro sport hockey is the latter. We have the whole up and down aspect with individual control of the players. We aren't aiming for the goal like Blades of Steel or ice hockey. It's true to form hockey. But the issue that I have with it is that your teammates, more often than not, will be off screen, so it can be tough to score or rely on your teammates. This is an expensive game as well. I mentioned it recently in another episode. It's not bad, it's just frustrating. Miss Pac-Man is interesting. Before doing a lot of research, I used to think that Miss Pac-Man was just an unlicensed improvement to Pac-Man courtesy of Midway. In fact, in one of my earliest videos, I erroneously claimed that they got sued for it, and they didn't. And guess what? I learned from that mistake. I learned how to do better research, to actually care about what I put into videos. It was an interesting experience, and I appreciate it. The true story of Miss Pac-Man is a little bit more complex. We all know Pac-Man, and if you're like me, you know Miss Pac-Man, which started as an enhancement kit called Crazy Otto, which was manifested by the General Computer Corporation. Now, it was GCC that was sued by Atari. Atari was big on suing people and themselves big on being sued. GCC was a tiny company, at least in comparison to Atari at the time, so with Crazy Otto in hand, they approached Midway, who at the time was releasing arcade titles for Namco in America. That's how we received Miss Pac-Man, which in my opinion is one of my favorite iterations of Pac-Man, period. It's just better. Now bear in mind, Tengen did make their own unlicensed release of this game, but in this case we're talking about the Namco port, and I do enjoy it. It's a wonderful game. In my opinion, Jimmy Connor's Tennis was eons ahead of its time. NMS Software did a badass job with this one. I consider this to be one of the best sports games on the system, hands down. The premise is simple. It's tennis, and we go through the ATP World Tour with varying difficulty levels. But what's so impressive to me is that this game looks gorgeous for what it is, and it runs incredibly smooth. The sprite work is impressive, the animation is seamless, and the physics of tennis are 100% there. If you want a solid tennis game on the NES, check this one out. It leaves its competitors in the dust. My first encounter with Cliffhanger was on the Sega CD, and when I tell you I would rather stub my toe perpetually on the corner of my table for the rest of my miserable, natural existence, I'm not kidding. I hate that game. The snowboarding levels alone are ungodly. But being that Cliffhanger had one of the best action stars of the era, Sony ImageSoft used and abused it to no end, creating numerous ports of the game, including on the NES. Now, the NES version obviously is fairly dumbed down, and that's okay. I don't expect the amount of buffoonery that we would see on the Sega CD. On the NES, that's just impractical. But here's the issue. This game, it's something else. For as far as I've made it in the game, I've only noticed that it's a walking simulator. We play as a green-haired Sylvester Stallone bebopping down the cliff. Dogs hate us, birds hate us even more, and don't even get me started about gravity. That fucking thing hates us the most. The music is unforgivably bad. The controls are stiffer than me when I wake up in the morning after sleeping 1 entire millimeter wrong. Yeah, it's a fiend. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is a wonderful film. I absolutely adore all of the indie movies, and so did a vast majority of children of the era, which is exactly why these games were licensed. Indiana Jones was a badass. To be honest, I didn't even know that there was an NES game. To date, I have only ever played the Indiana Jones point and clicks. I think that they're wonderful. Then we had the NES version. It was created by Software Creations and of course published by Taito. The game is very faithful, almost to the T when it comes to the source material. And we play as Indiana Jones looking for the Cross of Coronado, rescuing his father, finding the Holy Grail. Everything is there, and I am incredibly astonished to say, good work, Software Creations. For once. Most of their games on the NES, they weren't very good, and the only thing that could save them was Tim Follins, the legendary composer that, in my opinion, created the best music on the system. I might make a video talking about the best composers for the NES. Let me know down below if that's something that you would want to see. I'd love to make it. Chippendale Rescue Rangers 2 is another game we talked about during our brief series discussing the more expensive NES games out there, and in my opinion, it's worth it. If you've ever taken the time to play Chippendale Rescue Rangers, I found that Capcom did a wonderful job capturing the spirit of what Chippendale was. The sequel was just as fun. It kept everything that made the original game fun for me. You know, sometimes I knock Capcom for repeating the same formula for like Mega Man, but sometimes in short bursts, doing the same thing, it's not so bad, and this is an example of that. Bonks Adventure is a fun game, but it didn't originate on the NES. Instead, it originated on the TurboGrafx 16 and the PC Engine. We know it as Bonks Adventure, but the rest of the world, they knew it either as BC Kid or FC Kid. In some ways, Bonk was also the cash cow for Red Entertainment before their other games started picking up traction, like Sakura Wars. We play as a bald kid named Bonk who is good at one thing: headbutting people. He would make Roy O'Donovan smile and Manny Muscat cry. I do enjoy this game though. It's a straightforward platformer with levels that don't overstay their welcome, and really in any application I've seen this game, it's a good time. I will say this is one of the more expensive games on the system, so if you're looking forward to playing this on true hardware, you might want to save up a few paychecks. I want to say this is a downgrade, but if memory serves me right, from the get-go, Konami already wanted to create 3 different iterations of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. Obviously, the Super Nintendo version came out first, but the Genesis and the NES versions, they were planned from the beginning. In fact, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters is the final Konami game for the NES, but for some weird reason, they didn't release it in Japan, just Europe and the North American regions. We play as the 4 turtles, or whoever we choose from the 4, holding a contest to see who is capable of Bowser Kick overdriving Shredder into the next game. It's a fighting game and it's badass for what it is. Obviously, it's not going to look as great as the Super Nintendo and Genesis variances, and it's going to have some shortcomings being on the NES, but it's still really cool. Well, this is Alfred Chicken. He's the protagonist of his own little special platformer created by Twilight, of which was their last game. Alfred Chicken is a novelty little game with quirky elements. We play as Alfred and we go through the stages pecking eggs, balloons, dive bombing people, you know, the normal things that chickens do. I'll be honest with you though, if my chickens started dive bombing me, they'll find themselves dive bombing directly into a frying pan. It's a cute game, and in comparison to the other games that Mindscape published, this is kind of cool. Literally, our only objective is to peck all of the balloons, and then we fight a boss. It's like Kirby if he was a chicken and not at all Kirby. Star Tropics to me is a cult classic. If you've never played it, it's basically a 2D top-down action-adventure game. We play as Mikey, who goes to visit his uncle, Dr. Jones, on Sea Island. Except when he gets there, his uncle's gone, and instead, we run into the village chief, who gives us the best weapon ever from the 90s, the yo-yo. To tell you the story would spoil this game pretty bad, but there was a sequel, Zoda's Revenge, which in some way spoils it. Sorry, you wanted this video. With 9 awesome chapters, 8 of which jumping between different time periods, we again play as Mikey, and we meet tons of different historical figures. In some ways, it's Bill and Ted's Adventure, but good! Imagine that. Mickey had a little bit of a presence on the home consoles. I mean, why not? He was the face of Disney, and if given the chance to make an educational game with him, they would. And from the games that were released, and the latest one on the NES was Mickey's Adventure in Numberland. We go around collecting numbers because Pete is being a douchebag and trying to rob Numberland. We answer math questions over the course of 5 levels, and it's a simple game. It serves its purpose to the demographic that it's aimed for. Don't forget there are many other great Mickey Mouse games out there for various consoles. I'm impartial to Castle of Illusion. I find it to be an awesome game. This is the final NES era Mega Man, and for some reason, despite how popular this franchise was for Capcom, Capcom did not want to publish this in America. Nintendo was like, "Kutabare Capcom," and they did it themselves. It was still developed by Capcom. In fact, the Famicom version was developed and published by Capcom. They just didn't want to make it available in the United States, and I can't figure out why. It's likely because the NES lifespan was about to be over, and they were preparing to drop Mega Man 7 into our laps. But that's just speculation at best. Like most Mega Man games, we deal with Mr. X, who definitely isn't Dr. Wily. There's no way. Oh, fuck! Wrangled again! Basically, the world is tired of Dr. Wily's bullshit, so they create a global robot alliance. And they hold this tournament to find the strongest robot. And of course, it's held by Dr. X, which is Dr. Wily in disguise. And after years of Dr. Wily being a menace to society, he finally goes to prison. Good. Fuck him. This is an edutainment game featuring Mario. In some ways, it's an NES equivalent, or a Mario-esque equivalent, of Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego. And it's funny because many people despise this game, but for what it is, and the demographic it was aimed for, I honestly didn't mind it. It taught me some stuff. One of my rules, and it's a rule that I share with my children, is to tell myself that everyday living is another day learning. So fuck it, why not check it out? Originally, this game was created for DOS, and Knowledge Adventure set the framework for other companies to port it. Specifically, the Software Toolworks for the Super Nintendo and Radical Entertainment for the NES. You might recognize that company because they made Wayne's World. In the game, Bowser decides to create a time-ulator that allows him to travel throughout time and steal a bunch of artifacts from different eras. It's our job to grab these artifacts and bring them back to their appropriate time periods. And as a little bonus in the NES version, Bowser kidnaps Yoshi. Who even fucking does that? Why? I guess Bowser does. It's a neat game if you like educational titles. I mean, I'm not much for it, I could play it and enjoy it, but this game did the job. The Jungle Book is a great movie, and even before it was a movie, it was a great story from Rudyard Kipling in 1894. Obviously, Disney took some creative license and created a time-cherished film that I still watch with my kids to this day. And let me tell you something, no matter what you have on your schedule today, sit down, watch a movie with your kids. Time flies by way too quickly, and you don't want to miss the opportunity to see the twinkle in your kid's eye. Trust me. The game itself isn't too bad. We play as Mowgli and we go through the motions of the film, meeting characters we all know. I will say this game has tons of different versions, but to me, it's just a souped up Pitfall. I was born just late enough to miss out on the TV special The Incredible Crash Test Dummies, as well as the toy line. Growing up, the action figures I played with were either Spacemen, X-Men, Army soldiers, stuff that I could get from KB Toys, but for the life of me, I don't remember this. To be fair, the PSA that they were commonly involved with stopped in 1994, so I would have been 2 years old. The game, though, it's notoriously bad. We play as Spin and Slick, and we have to go save our pals, Spare Tire, Bumper, and Daryl from the evil Junkman. We overcome trivial obstacles through the course of 27 stages, all the while contending with some rather silly programming choices from Software Creations, the same people who brought us the symphonic messiah, Tim Fallen. Speaking of which, his brother Joff, he was the composer for this one. And here we are, the final licensed release on the NES in 1994, Wario's Woods. Little fun fact for you, it's the only NES game ever to receive an ESRB rating. That's how late this game was in the scope of video gaming history. The game is simple, it's a puzzle game where we have to clear a field of monsters by dropping specifically colored bombs. We do that with the intention of creating 3 or more objects of the same variance, which removes it from the field. So this is basically Magic Drop or Puyo Puyo. Hell, it's even kind of like Dr. Mario, but what's different to me is that we control Toad at the bottom of the screen, and he physically moves the pieces around. For it being the last licensed game, it's not terribly expensive, but it is somewhat awkward to control, but I think it's still fun. If you don't like it, maybe try the Super Nintendo version of the same game. And that's it for me today. What did you think about this list? I'm kind of curious. For those who were alive and gaming during the transition from the NES to the Super Nintendo, how did you feel knowing the next great era of gaming was just around the corner? Feel free to tell us down below. I know we would all love to hear your story. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. We're a community chock to the brim full of video game enthusiasts that really enjoy remembering a time where life was just a tad bit easier to live. And if you watch this video to the end, you're already home. Finally, the most important thing that you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.